Welcome to Mindcrime Liberty Show with me, Swithin Dobson, and him, Tim Patton. Today we are again joined by Sean Gabb to discuss how was it that Britain went from being the biggest empire in the world in 1914 to becoming the lapdog of the United States. What's particularly interesting here is we go from 1914, British Empire covers most of the globe. The sun never sets on it. And then 76 years later, Tony Blair basically will do whatever George W. Bush wants in Iraq and also Afghanistan. How was it that Britain went from such a high position in geopolitical power to a subservient position that we would basically do whatever the Americans wanted us to do? So, Sean, how did this come about?
Yes, thank you, Swithin, for having me. The question requires a rather long and complex answer. And because we're talking about a period that covers more than a century now, it is entirely inappropriate to speak about this as a single tendency with a single set of motivations. It would, of course, be possible to say that from the very beginning, as an independent nation, the Americans have been jealous of Britain's position in the world. They have also, let me change tack slightly. In 1760, there was a single English-speaking nation. We'll forget the Scottish and the Irish because they don't count. There was a single English-speaking entity with its capital in London and territories within the British Isles and over a great swathe of North America. Since 1776, or more appropriately since 1783, the Treaty of Paris that ended the Revolutionary War, there have been two English-speaking powers, each claiming historical legitimacy from the prior history of the English-speaking peoples. And it is like two brothers, only one of whom can inherit the entire estate. And so for a long time, the Americans believed that they were the true heirs of medieval England, and that England was in some ways a standing rebuke to them. And for a long time, we could ignore the Americans or patronize them, or somewhere between that, ignoring and patronizing. During the 20th century, the Americans had the chance to knock us off our perch, or to assist us in stepping down from it would be a more appropriate metaphor. And so they did. And the Americans have always had, well, no, not always, the Americans, since the middle of the 20th century, let's say, the Americans have had a strange view of England. Let us imagine, put yourself into an American's shoes. You speak a language which did not originate in your territory. Most of its classical literature was written by a foreign people. Your own ancestors quite often did not speak the language that you speak. You are speaking a language which your own nation has done almost nothing to develop, and in which your nation is sorely underrepresented in terms of its classical literature. Now, that is something that you can live with if the originating nation no longer exists or is of utter insignificance in the world. And so the Byzantines, they did not feel in any sense diminished by the fact that they spoke, that they wrote in and used for official purposes classical Greek, because the Greeks had disappeared. They had been subsumed into the Byzantine Commonwealth. It was all a very long time ago. For Americans, it was a standing rebuke to their nationhood in some respect, that the originating nation was still there, still in existence, still great, still wealthy, still a decided force in the world. And so when they were given the opportunity to humble that originator nation, they took full opportunity of it. They took full advantage of it. And so it is possible to say everything that's happened to us is the fault of jealous, malicious Americans. But as I've said, the Americans did not knock us off our perch in the middle of the 20th century. They assisted us in stepping down from it. But the problem is not the Americans. When Tony Blair begged to do George W. Bush's bidding, it wasn't because Britain is stuck in the American web like a fly, but the French have undergone a much greater decline in relative terms than we have, and yet they maintain a fully independent foreign and internal policy. They keep the Americans at arm's length. They do not do America's bidding. Indeed, after, I think, 1966, until sometime after the Cold War, the French did not take an active role in NATO. And so it's not the case that we are a wholly owned colony of the United States. And to speak of the American military bases here is really not to understand the way in which these dynamics work. The Americans have a very small number of troops, and they are just not capable in terms of personnel and infrastructure to carry out a Soviet-style takeover. The problem is and has been one entirely of our own ruling class. I suppose one could say that it's a combination of a sentimental misunderstanding of the Americans. They thought for a long time that they could manipulate the wealthier and then the more powerful Americans to achieve their foreign policy goals without having to spend large amounts of money, and sometimes that so much as lifting a finger. And more recently, it is because our ruling class has lost the will to power, except over us. It has also lost any regard for this country. The people who rule this country do not see themselves as English or British. They see themselves as having no commonality of interest with ordinary people. They do see themselves as privileged members of the international community, so they call it, or what many Americans would call the New World Order. And so for this reason, it is extremely convenient to hang on to the Americans, because they believe that they can have some influence without having to take us into their confidence. And of course, the more multinational the formal legitimacy of power becomes, the less accountable they become to us. What I'm saying is that the Americans, when they were given a chance, did take over. They jumped straight over us, but then who wouldn't? The problem is our own ruling class, which saw it as in its own class interest to destroy the foundations of British greatness and to make the country into a wholly owned subsidiary of the United States. That will have to do for the moment.
From reading Peter Hitchens, he points to two historical events which precipitate the American ascendancy relative to the British Empire, which was the war debts of the First World War, and also in particular our lack of naval supremacy in the Pacific after we reneged on the alliance with the Japanese. Would you agree with those as particular precipitating events that moved us down the sort of geopolitical pegs, as it were?
The war dead. So the dead in the Great War. It is a bit of. I'm not denying that the Great War was a terrible thing. Indeed, it killed at least 1 million too many young British men. But if you look at it in perspective, the die-off in the 4 years of the Great War does not really compare with the die-off during the Civil War of the 1640s, and it probably doesn't really compare that much with the die-off in the in the 7 Years' War, and certainly not the Napoleonic Wars, which were longer, which involved many more deaths, not necessarily in military action, but from disease, which was a far greater killer before the 20th century than weapons. And of course, in terms of piling up the national debt, the Great World War was a calamity, but it does not seem in any objective sense to have been a catastrophe. It was expensive in terms of lives, and as I said, because I would under no circumstances have got involved in that war, it was a total waste. It was also grotesquely expensive, but as I said, it doesn't really compare with the human and financial costs in relative terms of earlier wars. So the Great War as the cause of Britain's decline, I don't really believe that. I don't believe it at all. It may have. I think the myth of the Great War may have contributed to our decline, but the war in itself, although grotesquely and needlessly expensive, was not that expensive. As far as the naval race was concerned, the naval race with the Americans, I think we made a serious geopolitical error in 1922. We were the world's greatest naval power, and the Americans were not terribly worried about our own naval preponderance, but they were worried about the Japanese build-up in the Pacific, and they were threatening to build a fleet second to none, which panicked us because we didn't believe we could match that. And so we dumped the Japanese and made that alliance with the Americans, which for the next 20 years was absolutely worthless, and at the same time we alienated the Japanese. Now, from 1920 onwards, our greatest active enemy was the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had a large and active communist party in this country, which was actively working for a communist revolution. It was also sending agents of influence into India and to various other colonies to make trouble for us. And so our natural allies all through the 1920s and 30s were the Japanese, who could check the Russians in the east, the Japanese who could check the Russians in the east, and the Germans who could check the Russians in the west. And although I will admit that Hitler was at the very least a disreputable and untrustworthy character, Hitler was never an active threat to this country, and a more rational British foreign policy in the 1930s would have been to pinch our noses very tightly and point him ever further east. Ditto with the Japanese. I'm not glossing over the atrocities they committed in their attempted conquest of China, but the Japanese certainly had territorial ambitions which conflicted with those of the Soviet Union. Instead, we alienated the Chinese and we unaccountably drifted into a war with Germany. And all throughout, we were expecting that the Americans were our dearest friends and that they would, out of the goodness of their hearts, come and save us when we got into serious trouble, first with Germany and then with the Japanese in the early 1940s. It seems to have been a seriously misguided foreign policy. Oh, and I am fully aware of the atrocities committed by the Hitler regime, but I also bear in mind the numerically much greater atrocities committed by the Soviet Union. And so if you have to choose between disgusting regimes, it seems a better idea to choose the regime that is not a serious and active threat to yourself, which, as I said, the Germans were not. Indeed, I'm not sure the Germans were even that serious a threat in the early 1940s, since they couldn't get across the Channel. But coming back to America, we acted in the 1920s as though the Americans were our allies. We conducted ourselves in the 1930s on the assumption that if we needed them, the Americans would be there to bail us out. And when the Americans did come and bail us out, we didn't look too closely at the terms on which help was offered. And now you can what I'm saying is that this is not necessarily the cause of our decline. It is a symptom of our decline, that we have a delusional ruling class which is unable to see the world as it is. It was unable to see the world as it was in the 1920s and 30s. It was certainly unable to see the world in realistic terms for the first half of the 1940s. The Labour government in the second half of the 1940s actually had a much more realistic view of the world and our place in it, but they were then replaced in the 1950s by a Conservative government which was more than usually delusional, and British governments ever since have been lost in this delusion of British exceptionalism. Although we no longer rule the waves, the world looks up to us. We are a soft superpower. We are able to do this. We're able to do that. And of course, believing in the special relationship with America is part of that delusion. And although I have said a number of rather hurtful things about the Americans, that should be taken really as an angry lashing out. The real cause of our misfortunes is not in Washington, it's in London. It is the fact, it is not the fact that the Americans have humbled us and made us into a satrapy. It is the fact that our rulers have behaved in a way that made our humbling absolutely inevitable and possibly terminal.
I've asked Switham this question before, but at what point would Britain itself, in some sense, it already has, in some ways, accept formal U.S. Just divide up Britain into states and admit them into the United States? This is not entirely a far-fetched idea. In some ways, if you take a Keith Preston, we've had him on a number of shows about the U.S. empire worldview. In some sense, since some time in 30s, or definitely after Bretton Woods, most of Western Europe has been in some ways already done that, just to have some vague degree of sovereignty. At what point do Britons themselves feel that way at times? Would that be a more honest way to look at the relationship to Washington, or do you view yourself as choosing between Brussels or Washington? Sean?
Well, whose interest would that serve? It might serve the interests of much of the American people because of the great increase in the number of people like themselves that a British accession to the United States would bring. It might be in the interest of the British people because we would suddenly have cast iron, or at least stronger guarantees of freedom of speech than we have in the present order of things. And we might also find ourselves able to defend ourselves with a little better effect than we're currently allowed. But in what sense would that suit the interests of the British and American ruling classes? And they are the people who count in this kind of debate. It would not suit the interests of the British ruling class because their present monopoly over formal office in this country and the appearance of power over this country would be broken, and it would lead to a serious rebalancing in Washington, because the United Kingdom is a country with an official population of about 66 million people. That is something like a fifth of the United States' existing population. Can you think of how many senators would this bring into the American Congress? How many representatives? And what would it have? What effect would it have on the current balance between the parties? You then have the procedural matters. What changes would need to be made to things like the National Health Service and the weights and measures? It would fix the ruling classes in London and Washington with a generation of adjustments, sometimes painful readjustments, and they themselves would receive none of the benefits. So I don't see why it should happen. If there was a referendum in this country, England will be split in two. Scotland, Wales, and the two Irelands will enter as they are. We shall join the United States. The American Constitution and Bill of Rights will apply in full in this country, and we shall become American citizens. I think there would probably be a majority in favour. Things that would once have been sticking points, like the existence of the monarchy and the established Church of England, those no longer count. The monarchy has disgraced itself and has become a standing joke. The Church of England no longer exists, and so those are so much rubbish to be cleared away from the past. So there might be a majority in favour in this country, and in the United States, I should imagine that many of the people who voted for Donald Trump last week would feel rather happy to have an increase in their own people. But as I said, it comes back to who in Washington and London would benefit from this, and I don't see any particular benefit from them. All I see is costs that might be crippling for them.
When looking back at some British foreign policy from the post-Second World War period, we seem to be lockstep with the Americans in most cases, with two notable exceptions. Suez, where we tried to go it alone, and also a lack of involvement in Vietnam, considering we had been involved in Korea in the early 50s. What was particularly different about those two situations, which meant that we were, as it were, relatively more independent of American overseas adventures? Or was it just mere chance of who was there at the time? Or is there anything from these that can be learnt from today which might be useful in establishing a more independent foreign policy in the future?
Suez is it's an interesting set of events. It is possible to look at it as an American stab in the back. They let us down. They turned on us. However, look at it this way. The British possession of the Suez Canal was critical to our own control of the Mediterranean and to our own vague hegemony over the Indian Ocean and to our general place in the world. This was nationalised by a weak third world government, and it was a challenge to us. An effective, a committed ruling class, a ruling class that was committed to the maintenance of Britain's world position, even a somewhat diminished world position, and yes, just a ruling class that was committed to the maintenance of our world position, would have crushed the Egyptians. And we did. We formed a coalition with ourselves, the French and the Israelis, and neither of our allies was particularly weak or in any sense lacking in resolution. And the Americans told us to stop. They told us to stop, or they would make things difficult on the foreign exchanges for the pound, and we might have a bit of trouble rolling over some of our inflated national debt, and the Americans would be displeased with us. Now, a ruling class committed to its stated duty would have told the Americans, stuff you, you try it. You need us to pursue your vendetta against the Soviet Union. If you rub us up the wrong way, you can kiss your bases in Britain goodbye, and you can sort out the Russians by yourselves. And we'd also said, and if you want to make life difficult for the pound, well, stuff Bretton Woods, we'll float the thing, and then the pound can be whatever it's worth on the markets. And let's see what you can do about that, because what we do, other people will do, and the dollar hegemony might not be so entirely fixed as before. And my understanding is that we were within 24 hours of completely defeating the Egyptians. Not that that would have been terribly hard at the time. And yet the people in charge in London stopped. They didn't stop because the Americans put overwhelming pressure on us, but because they threatened to make things a bit inconvenient in the short run. And so the lesson that I take from Suez is that by 1956, and probably for a long time before then, we had a ruling class which was a fraud, a cardboard tank, men without testicles, there you go. And everything follows from that. If the Conservatives had won the 1964 or the 1966 elections, yes, probably they would have taken part in the Vietnam adventure. But although I hate and abominate Harold Wilson, in terms of his foreign policy, I see nothing particular. I see nothing objectionable. The Americans had let us down at Suez, or they had revealed our own lack of will. And so, if they wanted us to help them in Vietnam, well, they could go jump for it. That's probably one of the few policies of the 1964 Labour government that I would have wholeheartedly supported. Well, I suppose the decriminalisation of homosexuality and the ending of theatre censorship. Yes, but certainly the independent foreign policy, for the most part, was an entirely good thing. So, yes, Suez is interesting. It's interesting not because the Americans turned on us. Indeed, that they accepted afterwards that they had made a serious mistake. That they could have put the lid on Arab nationalism and kept the Soviets out of the Middle East. And I think Eisenhower himself said later on that if the British had ignored him and carried on, he'd have rolled over. He wouldn't have cared that much. Now, what it shows is not American perfidy. It shows the utter ineffectiveness, the utter lack of any killer instinct by our own ruling class. It shows their decadence and their unfitness to rule. And this has continued ever since. When did the British government ever do... What was the last... When was the last time a British government conducted its foreign policy in the interests of the British people? Maybe when Margaret Thatcher took back the Falkland Islands, but I mean, that's about it. That's about it.
The interesting thing about the Falkland War was it was, in a way, a first time that Britain might have operated in its own self-interest in a number of years. The interesting thing about Vietnam is you didn't go along. What explains the difference there with Iraq? And additionally, this is probably the more important question, are you glad in some ways, both of you, or in particular you, Sean, that Britain is no longer the great empire that it was, considering the fact that the last time it probably tried to act like one was in Suez? It could have, in theory, done so. Or is this a happy event? I mean, Vietnam was a quagmire under Westmoreland et al. Nothing really was. Maybe some opaque domino theory was justified in some neoconservative circles. I think Henry Kissinger still defends the thing. And of course, the later ones, Iraq was. I think we just recently signed some deal with the actual. So, I mean, I've heard various people say Saddam is probably much better than the cast of characters there. But nonetheless, are you glad that Britons are out of the game of empire in some formal sense? Is this a positive conclusion? You've pointed out you lost the killer instinct, but is this a positive thing or is this a negative thing in some ways?
I live in a country where it is dangerous. Not legally dangerous as such, but it can be dangerous for one's career and general standing to admit to any pride in the creation and maintenance of the British Empire. Many of my ancestors took part in building and maintaining the empire, always in a very humble position. Little soldiers. One of my great grandfathers was the manager of the rope making factory in Chatham, and he spent the Great War as the manager of the rope making factory in Calcutta dockyard. And so I will not give you a direct answer to the question, do I feel proud of the British Empire? Instead, I'll say that in retrospect, it was a bad idea. Indeed, many people at the time thought it was a bad idea. One of the problems with building up such a great empire is that it involved us in foreign policy complications right across the world. There should have been no reason, if we hadn't been worried about the northwestern frontier, why we should have found ourselves at loggerheads with the Russians. The needs, so long as we were the world's leading industrial power, so long as we were the richest country in the world, so long as we were the only country with a functional steel industry and railway lines, the empire was extraordinarily cheap. It was something that most people didn't even notice. But this was a transient moment, rather as the Americans are discovering. The technologies that were developed in the United States have now been adopted right across the world, and American global dominance is no longer what it was even 30 years ago. And so by the early 20th century, maintaining the empire was an increasingly difficult business. In 1910, If we got into a war with a first-class enemy in Europe, we could deal with that. If we got into a war with a first or second-class enemy in the Mediterranean, we could deal with that, and in the Far East. But wars in more than one place would put us under extreme pressure, and that is something that is a consideration which did not go away. It was to some extent alleviated by the Great War, because the destruction of Germany meant that there was no longer any first-rate power in Europe. The Russians didn't amount to very much. And although we had annoyed the Japanese, we were not actively competing for influence. But certainly by 1939, we could fight a war against Germany, or we could fight a war against Japan. It was plain that we couldn't fight a war with both. And this involved us in foreign policy difficulties that led to national bankruptcy by 1945. And so the empire may have looked a glorious thing at the time of the Golden Jubilee, though probably it was a more solidly glorious thing in the 1870s. But by the 1930s, it was something that needed, as a matter of urgency, to be wound down. And certainly after 1945, getting rid of as much of the empire as possible was an entirely worthwhile thing. And this brings me back to Suez. In fact, I would not have lifted a finger when the Egyptians nationalized the Suez Canal, because I would not have regarded Britain as a global power. I would have seen no particular value in dominating the Indian Ocean. I'd have seen no particular value even in being the hegemonic naval power in the Mediterranean. I would have just shrugged and walked away and carried on forcing colonies to become independent, just dumping them. But having announced, if for whatever reason I decided, yes, we're going to take back the Suez Canal, I'd have done so. I'd have done so with overwhelming force. And even if I walked away from it 5 years later, it would have been a voluntary act, not a scuttling. And so the empire did us no particular good. It didn't make us richer than we would otherwise have been, indeed it made us probably a great deal poorer. I believe that our trade with Germany in 1914 was greater than our entire trade with India, and intra-imperial trade as a whole was probably not worth as much as our trade with the United States, and I believe even our trade with Argentina was more important than our trade with India. The empire made some individuals rich. It made some companies rich, but I'm not sure that it enriched us as a whole. It was an effect of the great preponderance that we achieved in the 19th century. It was never a cause of that, and it may even have been a partial cause of our fall after about 1930.
I was going to ask in relation to that, because you've alluded to it a few times, that the problem with Britain and England is the English ruling class rather than the Americans per se. That's merely a symptom. Obviously, there will be multiple factors which will have caused the decline of the English ruling class. But what would you say would be the main causes of that? We go from sort of the high point, let's say, I said 1914, but let's say 1870 as a late 19th century period. We have an English ruling class which has sort of is assertive, it knows its own interests and it pursues their interests, to the one that we have, the supine one of the Blair era, and even you've said it was going wrong even in the 20s, the 30s, and the 40s. What really changes in the sort of like the late 19th century into the early 20th, which precipitated, at least in part, this kind of weakness of will in the English ruling class?
It's obviously a difficult question to answer because it's an area of historiography which has piled up a mountain of literature. I am inclined towards the Curley-Barnett belief that as the 19th century proceeded, the British ruling class lost its will to power. It believed that Britain's hegemonic status in the world was a law of nature, and that there was nothing much that could ever shake it, and so it was entirely affordable to cease to be particularly assertive with regard to the national interest. For example, the Trent incident, do you remember that? Well, it's unlikely that any of us would remember it, but during the American Civil War, a number of privateer vessels were built in British yards for the South to use for raiding purposes, to try to make trouble for the North. And after the Civil War, or the war between the states, whatever you want to call it, was over, the federal government in Washington demanded compensation. The Gladstone government in the early 1870s accepted international arbitration, which ruled against us, and we paid compensation to the Americans. I would have refused point blank even to consider such a thing. I'd have told the federal government to go jump. Not because I support the South in that particular war, but simply because if one group of foreigners wants to buy British weapons to use against another group of foreigners, it's not my business. It's not illegal under our laws to make and sell such things. And so why should we pay any compensation whatever? But instead, the ruling class thought that it was a good thing to conciliate the Americans, whereas, as I said, I would have refused. Now, Curley-Barnett in his Collapse of British Power, something I read when I was 15 with great pain, because it caused many scales to fall from my eyes, even though I no longer accept his economic analysis. But Curley-Barnett does heap up a great mass of evidence for the flight from reality of the British ruling class during the 19th century, and its continuing drift into self-delusion during and after the Great War, right up until the Second World War, and indeed thereafter. The belief that, actually, the world owed us a living. However, there is another possible explanation which is worth exploring. And this is that the 19th century saw a change in the class basis of the British governing elite. In about 1850, let's say in 1830, this country was ruled by the landed aristocracy, hereditary landowners who could trace their origins back to the dissolution of the monasteries when their rather tight-fisted ancestors had bought up great tracts of land, or perhaps to the 1660s, 70s and 80s. Whatever the case, these people, their families had run the country for several centuries and done so with considerable success. From the 1830s, these people were gradually eased out of their dominant role by a new class of middle-class officials. There is no central event in this switchover. I suppose you could say it was the 1906 general election, but you could say that the switchover had been largely complete for a generation before then. The switchover is disguised by the fact that the new ruling class of middle class, of very upper middle class professionals, the office holders, the officials, that they attended the same schools as the old aristocracy, and they sounded and looked like the old aristocracy. They wore the same kinds of clothes, and so it is difficult, unless you dig into their family histories, to see that there was any particular change. And certainly to outsiders, there was no change at all. But whereas the landed aristocracy had a much more cautious and limited and realistic view of what the British state could do, the new ruling class didn't have that understanding, and it believed that if it was reasonable with foreigners, then foreigners would be reasonable with it. And even if you, well, that didn't work out too well in the 1930s or 40s, did it?
You used the word foreigners to describe the Trent incident regarding this Trent affair regarding the Civil War. That's an interesting word to use, as since we share basically a common language. The culture question is more interesting. I believe you were on Tom Wood's show once, and I think you asked the same question stated. And for better or for worse, I tend not to view either of you as capital F foreigners in any meaningful way. I can trace my one side of my family back to Northern Ireland and then Scotland, whether those are foreigners. When I'm in Northern Ireland, I didn't, other than the existence of thousands of cameras, I didn't really view myself, I didn't really feel like a foreigner there. When I'm in rural France or Taiwan or Egypt, I don't feel like a foreigner. I don't feel like a foreigner when I'm in Canada. Whether Canadians feel like a foreigner or Britons feel like a foreigner when they're in the United States is of some question. But we do tend to share cultural events, similar. We both have similar trajectories in terms of socio-political events and various other things. So there is a common belief. We've never had formal fascism or formal communism in either of our countries, as well as Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the other dominions as well. Do you view us Americans as foreigners? And when did this kind of relationship develop?
All right. No, of course I don't regard you as a foreigner, and that is part of the difficulty, and I suppose one cannot entirely blame the ruling class for its delusion, because the British and American peoples are, I don't have a particular name for us, but it's rather like Athenians, Corinthians, Ephesians, Syracusans, and so on. They were all Greeks, even though they did not live under the same government, not at least until the Romans took over the Mediterranean. And so, whatever you want to call us, yes, we are a single people, and it would be wholly inappropriate for us to regard each other as foreigners. That being said, we do live in countries which have somewhat different interests, and it would be helpful if my government in particular were clearly to understand that the interests of the United Kingdom or the interests of England are not entirely congruent with those of the United States, just as the Americans know perfectly well that their interests are not fully aligned with the interests of my country. But on the subject of foreigners, I spent a couple of years in Czechoslovakia in the early 1990s after the collapse of communism, and a rather strange time, rather strange place. And there were British people there, and there were Americans, and there were Germans, and there were many different groups of people. But what I found was that the people with whom I went to dinner, the people I would sit with on Sunday and Saturday would be the Americans, because we were a single group of people. The boundaries did not run between us, but around us. And it's also something that I've noticed at conferences of the Property and Freedom Society in Bodrum. Of course, there is no national animosity at these things, but I've always generally sat with English-speaking people, and it's not just a matter of language, though language is enormously important, but it is just the fact that we understand each other. And even when we find that there are differences, we can express them very clearly in words and discuss and analyze them. So yes, perhaps I should clarify, I do not regard Americans as foreigners in the way that I regard the French as foreigners. Not that I have any ill feeling towards the French. But at the same time, we do live in different countries, and our countries have somewhat different interests. And it might actually be to the advantage of people in both our countries if it could be clearly accepted at all levels that there is not a commonality of foreign policy interests.
If Britain were to have a more independent foreign policy going forward, how would you think that might come about, or how might they be able to achieve that? I'm thinking in particular of Trident, which is allegedly an independent nuclear deterrent, but the Americans build it and we buy it from them. If we were to say to the Americans, no, we're not getting involved in Libya, or potentially Iran is probably the latest one on the American list, I would expect. Would that cause any problem for Trident? And if it did, is that really a problem? What would the basic question is this: what does the British ruling class need to do to just become broadly independent of the Americans? Do they just need to say no? I mean, is it simple as that, or would there be other things that would be required beforehand?
No, it is as simple as that. You just say no. But what complicates the matter is that we have, and for a long time have had, a ruling class which is unwilling or unable to say no. And so we would need some kind of revolution in this country. And when I talk about revolutions, I don't mean shooting people. I just mean a radical changeover at the top. The removal of tens of thousands of people from positions of influence and their replacement with people who had perhaps a rather better regard for this country and its peoples than the present lot have. And we could then just tell the Americans, no, please remove your bases, because we feel that we're in no particular danger of being invaded by anybody, and so your support in this area is nowadays redundant, and we will consider cooperating with you in your various foreign policy ventures, but our cooperation will be based on a consideration of our own interests. And if that were to happen, I suppose you might say, if you were conspiratorial, that the American deep state would immediately start assassinating British cabinet ministers, but I'm not sure that that would happen. I think the Americans would just shrug and get on with it. It's not as if we were threatening to undermine their own foreign policy by doing that. We're not actually terribly important as far as the Americans are concerned. And so if we began to behave a little more like the French, it would not be a bad thing. Now, pardon me, on Facebook the other day, I said that a Biden-Harris presidency would not necessarily be a bad thing for Britain. Something that stops a more hard-nosed assessment and assertion of my own country's national interest is this sentimental and increasingly desperate belief in a special relationship, and that because the Americans love us so much, we must, of course, go along with them because it gives us a great deal of influence in the world that we might not otherwise have. And what I so much liked about the Obama presidency, and of course I don't live in America, I didn't have to live under the no doubt unwelcome changes that he made in America's domestic government. What I liked about the Obama presidency is that he had absolutely no interest in pretending that there was a special relationship. And one of the problems with the Trump presidency is that although it began rather well, he allowed us to drift back into the delusion of a special relationship. Well, we know that Joe Biden does not like England. He defines himself as an Irish American, and so in any dispute between Britain and the European Union over the Northern Irish border, he will side with the European Union, or more particularly with the Irish. And I believe Kamala Harris dislikes England, perhaps even more than she dislikes America, which is probably saying a lot. And so our own ruling class might find itself outside the invisible glass door in Washington, suddenly no pretense of influence, but instead a series of increasingly insistent orders from Washington to do things that might be rather unwelcome. And either this will force the existing ruling class to reassess its own long-term interests, or it will so discredit this ruling class that we might have a chance of getting something a little more congruent with our national interest. But one of the problems with Republican administrations in America is that although they've never been as pro-British as British politicians claim, they've always had a soft spot for England, and a bit like a beaten wife who keeps going back because the husband buys her flowers and smiles at her every so often between repeated bouts of beating. Whereas the thing about Obama, Biden, Harris is that there'll be no smiles, no flowers, no chocolates, just continued insane rages interspersed with beatings, which is probably rather better in the long term. Though I stand to be corrected on that.
The best thing Biden said about Ireland, he said, "I may be Irish, but I'm not stupid." That was the best thing I heard him say on that. But I think we're coming to the end now. I'd like to thank you, Sean, for joining us again. That was an interesting conversation. If any of you would like to look at Sean's work, he has a website, www.seangabb.co.uk, where you can look at his academic work, his work in the classics, and all his libertarian writings. I'd like to thank everyone for listening. If you've enjoyed this, please subscribe to us on YouTube, on Podbean, and comment below if you so wish. And if you wish to contact us directly, please contact us at mindcrimelibernetyshow@gmail.com. That's mindcrimelibernetyshow@gmail.com. gmail.com.